Thank you, John, and thank you, those of you who've called in, um, for your interest in this uh, annual report on the state of the Pennsylvania labor market. Next slide, please, John. Okay, so let me just summarize kind of the big messages from this report. The first is that there is some good news in this report. Unemployment's continued to decline. Other measures of labor market slack have improved, and there were wage increases across the board in 2018 in Pennsylvania. But as we'll dig into, there are some major caveats to that glimmer of good news. First of all, it took until year 9 of an economic expansion to get the first broad-based wage increases. We used to see 3% wage increases every year, not once every 20 years. Another caveat is that wages are still falling for African Americans in Pennsylvania, and the long-term trends are still overwhelmingly that the benefits of growth are tilted to the top. One other piece of good news that we'll dig into at the end of this presentation is that there are some national business leaders that in the last couple of weeks have come forward with some fairly blunt statements about how skewed growth is and how that's a problem. And so, based on that opening, our recommendations call on Pennsylvania business leaders to join with others to take some specific actions to raise workers' pay. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go quickly through not all, but many of the slides in the report. So the first part of the report is takes a look at how the economy and job growth are going. So as this chart shows, GDP growth continued through the first quarter of this year, which is the latest data we've got. So there have been a bunch of stories in the last few weeks about economic uncertainty or possibly recession looking forward a year or 18 months, long-term interest rates being lower than short-term interest rates on bonds, the so-called inversion, a lot of back and forth regarding tit-for-tat tariff increases between the U.S. and China. So a lot of anxieties, a stock market that's bouncing up and down. But the fact is, as far as we can tell in the data on growth itself, the expansion kind of continues moving steadily forward. Next slide, please, John. So this picture shows what's happening in terms of job growth. Basically, there are two measures of job growth that are used. The one that's most often quoted is based on employer data on the number of people on business payrolls, and the other is based on a household survey, so-called resident and employment. But what this chart shows that in most years, these two measures have been growing together since the recovery began in 2009, but this chart begins at the beginning of 2010, and those two series departed a little bit in 2016 to 2018, and the household survey measure of employment actually caught up a little bit in the last year with the employer-based measure. But again, the bottom line is, as far as we can tell in the data, continuing growth. One series slowed down a bit this year. The other series actually was pretty healthy. Next slide, please. So another sign of strengthening economy has been continued falling unemployment. In fact, Pennsylvania unemployment earlier this year dropped below 4% for the first time since at least 1976. When I say at least, what that means is that the Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't report unemployment rate by month for states any earlier than 1976. Probably Pennsylvania unemployment rate hasn't been below 4% since 1970 or 1969. So that's now our unemployment rate, which was about half a percentage point above the U.S. level for 2-3 years, And now the two are virtually identical. Next slide, please. So another measure of labor market slack, the underemployment rate, which includes sort of three different groups of people that aren't counted as unemployed. The report explains in a little box who those three groups of workers are. But again, they're basically underemployment has gone steadily down. Now, it is true that underemployment is still more than a percentage point above where it was at the end of the 1990s, economic expansion and into 2001. So whereas unemployment is lower than it has been since, again, the first part of the 70s, that's not true of underemployment. So that's one indication that there's still some slack in the labor market, but still by and large improvement. Next slide, please. And this is what's called the employment rate. What that is the share of adults 20 and over that have a job. And again, it fell dramatically at the beginning of the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, in both Pennsylvania and the U.S., and has then slowly recovered over the past sort of 9 years. That measure of the labor market is still quite short of where it was in Pennsylvania. That's the green line in 2007 and 2008. So we estimate that if we were back at the 2007 level of the employment rate, which was close to 62%, we'd have another 150,000 jobs in Pennsylvania. So, another indication that, yes, the labor market is tighter than it has been, but still there is room for further tightening. Next slide, please. Okay, now we switch to wages, and this chart basically shows the best news in the report from the perspective of Pennsylvania workers. The dark green lines all point upwards, and except for the 70th percentile, they're all at 2.5% growth in inflation-adjusted wages or more. At the median, the 50th percentile, we're just over 3%. The average across all of the deciles is a 3.1% growth rate. And what you also see is that our wage growth has been more robust in 2018 than surrounding states. So that's good news. Next slide, please. But what this shows is wage growth over a much longer period of time. And what this, again, indicates is that wage growth has been much less healthy. This goes through an entire business cycle. So from the 2007 peak to basically 2018, which is the latest data that we have. And again, the dark green lines are above the regional lines, but the annual rate of growth of wages for the bottom half of the distribution up to the median is at or below 0.5% a year. Again, that's in the good old days, we did used to get 3% growth in wages a year, basically from the late 40s through the 1970s, and we are a long way from that in the current business cycle. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to switch to an examination of kind of racial trends in the job market, primarily black versus white in Pennsylvania, although there's a little bit of information coming up on Hispanics. What this chart shows basically is that black unemployment is much higher than white in both Pennsylvania and the United States. So this is the ratio of black to white unemployment. So the bottom of the graph is 1.5. And most of both lines are above 2, including the recent years of both lines and You also see that the ratio in Pennsylvania, the dark green line, is higher than the ratio in the United States. That's the yellow line. So again, black unemployment in Pennsylvania is now 8.4%, and is the fourth highest of the 20 plus states for which reliable measures are available. So that's not particularly good news. Next slide, please. Neither is this. Again, this shows in the U.S. and Pennsylvania white wage trends at the median since 1979, and then black, the lower two lines. And what you basically see is, while the top two lines, the white medians, go up recently and in the late 1990s, that doesn't happen for the black median. Next slide, please. This is sort of the same information, but presented a slightly different way. And so the black median is a percent of the white median, and it again tells that story about in the 80s through the first part of the 1990s, in both Pennsylvania and nationally. Nationally, there was a bit of erosion in the black wages as a share of white. In Pennsylvania, things bounced around. White workers had a pretty difficult 1980s, as did black workers in Pennsylvania. But then what you see is that steady downward dark green line from about 1984, 34 to about 2000. So during, again, the economic gains of the Clinton expansion, white workers did better, black workers did not. And so you've had the same phenomenon recently. White workers on a modest upward escalator, but not black workers. So black workers' wages are now less than 3/4 of white in both Pennsylvania and the United States. Next slide, please. So this is a dense slide that is in the appendix to our report, and you don't have to be able to read it now, but we wanted to make sure that the trends you've just seen of white versus black median wages are not just an artifact of the median. So this other chart shows for every year and decile for which reliable estimates are available for black and white wages. We look at the ratio of the black wages at the given decile, actually, to the white wages. And what you see is that the trends in all of the available data from the 30th percentile to the 70th percentile, the broad trends are exactly what you've seen for the median. So, this is a broader story of black workers not sharing at all in economic gains, even in the occasional good times that we've had. Next slide, please. And again, this is the only available data we have on Hispanic workers. Those samples weren't big enough, except starting in 2000 and except at the median. And the broad trends are that until recently, last couple of years, Hispanic wages have been even less than black at the median, but actually Hispanic workers in the last couple of years have actually seen their wages go up some. Next slide, please. So there's a new report. It's national data that came out earlier this month from the Economic Policy Institute, and it's an update of their series on CEO compensation. And again, what it shows you is basically this increase from a ratio of a CEO pay to regular worker pay that goes from somewhere between 15 and 20 in the mid-60s, depending on which series you use, to somewhere between 200 and 300 in the last sort of 20 years. And it bounces around, but it stays at that kind of elevated level. Next slide, please. And so CEO pay is one of the things that drives the rising share over time of income that goes to the top 1%. This slide has updated data for the U.S. for 2 more years compared to the slide we showed last year. We don't yet have updated data for 2016 and 17 for Pennsylvania, but again, what the last 2 years of data for the U.S. show is sort of another slight uptick in the share of all income going to the top 1%. Next slide, please. So the CEO pay graph, and actually one thing I should add is that just within the last hour or two, we got some additional data on CEO pay for Pennsylvania. So we're actually going to add that in the next 24 hours to our report, and therefore there'll be a slightly updated version available online. But the trends in CEO pay are potentially one of the things that may have contributed recently to the unexpected bout of conscience from national business leaders. A couple of weeks ago, the National Business Roundtable came out with a statement basically saying that corporations need to be accountable to not just shareholders, but also employees, customers, and suppliers. And then the day after that, exactly 2 weeks ago, the chair of the executive committee of the U.S. Chamber, the All-State CEO, Tom Wilson, had an op-ed entitled "Save Capitalism by Paying People More." And so I'm deliberately quoting him here with the exception of, there's a paraphrase in the third to last sub-bullet, but otherwise it's exactly his words. Most Americans are struggling. A 2017 survey showed 40% do not have $400 for an emergency. Being broke while working is not an American value. Less than half of young Americans today support capitalism. The next bullet is, he tells a famous story about the United Auto Workers Union president in the 1950s being shown around the Cleveland engine plant, and some executive gloating that pointed to some automation and robots that pretty soon they wouldn't need any of Reuther's UAW members to work in the factories, at which point Reuther pointed out that machines don't buy Fords. And so Wilson again was acknowledging in an unambiguous way that workers are customers too, and it's their wages that help drive the economy forward. So his bottom line is that American businesses need to focus on more than making profit. And he also pointed out that businesses prosper by creating specific goals and executing plans. This must now be applied to creating higher paying jobs. Next slide, please. So the end of our report is basically saying that Pennsylvania business leaders should take a page out of the new book of their national counterparts and begin to address inequity and the struggles of working families in Pennsylvania. The good news is that there's 3 immediate ways to do that are on the table in Harrisburg. One is there's been a debate over several years about raising the Pennsylvania minimum wage. All the surrounding states have raised their minimum wage. You can see the benefits of that at the bottom end of the wage distribution in those surrounding states. The legislature had a more serious discussion of raising the minimum wage in the context of the budget debate in June, but in the end did not include a minimum wage increase in the budget. The legislature and the governor are expected to return to that issue just a few weeks in September. It's time to raise the Pennsylvania minimum wage. And Wilson in his op-ed also made it clear that he supports a minimum wage increase. Pennsylvania's business leaders should do the same. Second proposal that's on the table. Last June, a year ago, actually 15 months ago, Governor Wolf came forward with a proposal to raise the threshold below which salaried workers automatically get overtime. This would benefit nearly 500,000 lower paid Pennsylvania salaried workers. Back in the 1970s, more than 60% of U.S. workers were automatically eligible for overtime. That's the way the law was written nationally in 1938 and the way the Pennsylvania law was written, salaried workers were supposed to get overtime pay unless they were sufficiently high executives or professionals or did high level administrative work that meant they had enough leverage and importance in their employer that they'd make a decent salary without overtime. That commitment that was part of the New Deal uh, was abandoned after the middle 1970s. And so again, now many businesses just simply call people salaried and use that as an excuse for not paying them overtime, even if they don't do anything very different than hourly workers. That's an overreach. It's unfair. It has some salaried workers working 50 and 60 hours a week for basically the equivalent of $10 an hour or less. So far, the business community in Pennsylvania has sort of been pretty robotically against that change. If they came to realize that that's an example of the overreach that Tom Wilson talks about, then that's a change that we could get through in a matter of months. A third change that's on the table is the governor's proposal to increase teacher salaries to $45,000 a year. That would help retain and attract great teachers, which would help our schools create a better workforce of the future for Pennsylvania businesses. Then the last proposal here is, again, harking back to Wilson's observations that when businesses really want to do something, they develop plans and then they execute those plans. If business leaders really are concerned that they need to save American and Pennsylvania capitalism by paying people more, then we need a plan to do that. And we suggest that the Middle Class Task Force, which is an existing body a few years old that's co-chaired by Gene Barr of the Pennsylvania Chamber and Rick Bloomingdale of the Pennsylvania AFL-CIO. So this kind of plan is a natural charge for that group. And with that, let me stop, John, and see if folks have any questions.